In the depths of the Cold War, when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation, the United States military developed a plan so terrifying, so catastrophically comprehensive, that even the generals who created it prayed it would never be used. This was the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. A doomsday blueprint that would unleash over 3,000 nuclear warheads on the Soviet Union and China in a coordinated strike so massive it would kill an estimated 600 million people in the first few hours alone. But here's what makes this plan truly chilling. It wasn't designed to be flexible or proportional. It was an all-or-nothing gambit, where the moment it was triggered, there was no turning back. No de-escalation, no mercy, and the architects of this apocalyptic strategy knew exactly what they were creating, because when President John F. Kennedy was first briefed on PSYOP in 1961, he walked out of the room visibly shaken, reportedly saying to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, that the plan was little more than organized mass murder. Yet, despite this horror, despite the moral revulsion it inspired in those who truly understood its implications, PSYOP remained America's primary war plan for decades, continuously updated and refined with new targets, new weapons, and new delivery systems, because the logic of mutually assured destruction demanded that any response to Soviet aggression be so overwhelming, so utterly devastating, that no rational actor would dare provoke it. But let's step back and understand how we arrived at this nightmarish scenario. Because the story of PSYOP begins not with the plan itself, but with the peculiar madness of nuclear strategy in the 1950s. When the United States and Soviet Union were locked in an arms race that defied all conventional military logic, where victory was measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the capacity to annihilate the other side so completely that their civilization would cease to exist, and in this bizarre calculus, the Pentagon's Strategic Air Command, led by the legendarily hawkish General Curtis LeMay, had developed dozens of separate, uncoordinated nuclear war plans, each branch of the military hoarding its own targets like jealous children. The Air Force had its list of Soviet cities and military installations, the Navy had its own targets for submarine-launched missiles, and the Army controlled tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, all operating independently with virtually no communication or coordination, which meant that in the event of war, multiple American nuclear weapons might be assigned to destroy the same target, while other crucial enemy installations went untouched. It was strategic chaos masquerading as deterrence, and President Dwight Eisenhower, himself a five-star general who understood military organization, recognized this insanity for what it was and demanded reform. So in 1960, his administration ordered the creation of a single, unified nuclear war plan that would bring all American nuclear forces under one coordinated strategy. And what emerged from this directive was SIOP 62, the first iteration of the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which became operational on April 1, 1961. And when military planners presented this new strategy to civilian leadership, what they revealed was almost beyond comprehension, because SIOP 62 identified over 4,000 targets across the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, categorizing them into military installations, industrial centers, and urban population zones. And the plan called for hitting all of these targets simultaneously in a massive first strike that would involve approximately 3,400 nuclear warheads delivered by bombers, missiles, and submarines in a carefully choreographed symphony of destruction. The total explosive yield of this attack would be approximately 7,400 megatons, which for context is roughly equal to 1,400,000 Hiroshima bombs detonated within a span of a few hours. And according to Pentagon estimates, this would result in approximately 275 million deaths in the Soviet Union alone, with another 300 million deaths in China and Soviet-aligned countries. And these were just the immediate casualties from blast effects and thermal radiation. The estimates didn't fully account for the radioactive fallout that would spread across the northern hemisphere, the nuclear winter that would follow from the smoke and debris injected into the atmosphere, or the complete collapse of global agriculture that would condemn hundreds of millions more to starvation. And here's the truly insane part. SIOP made no distinction between different levels of Soviet aggression. Whether the Soviets launched a limited attack on Western Europe, invaded a neutral country, or accidentally triggered a nuclear exchange through miscalculation, the American response would be identical: total annihilation. There was no option for a proportional response, no way to signal restraint or seek de-escalation. It was as if the United States had replaced its entire military toolkit with a single weapon, a hammer so large and destructive that it could only be used to demolish everything in sight. And when President Kennedy learned of this inflexibility, he was appalled. Here was a man who had campaigned on being tough on communism, who had faced down Khrushchev in Vienna and would soon face the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet even he recognized that SIOP's rigidity was not strength, but dangerous recklessness. Because what use is a deterrent so terrible that you could never credibly threaten to use it for anything less than an existential threat? The Soviets could reasonably gamble that America would not incinerate the entire northern hemisphere over a conventional attack on West Berlin or a proxy conflict in the Third World, which meant that despite its overwhelming firepower, SIOP actually weakened American deterrence by removing flexibility from nuclear strategy. So Kennedy ordered his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, to develop more flexible response options, leading to subsequent iterations like SIOP 63, which introduced the concept of withholds, where certain categories of targets, particularly cities in Soviet-aligned countries like China, could be spared in the initial strike to leave room for negotiation and de-escalation. But even these modifications retained the fundamental horror of the plan, which was the acknowledgement that any nuclear exchange, no matter how carefully calibrated at the start, would likely escalate beyond control as both sides faced the impossible choice between surrender and launching their remaining weapons. And this brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of ISOP, which was the military's contingency planning for decapitation strikes. Scenarios where Soviet nuclear weapons wiped out Washington, D.C. and most of the American civilian and military leadership in the opening minutes of a war. To ensure that ISOP could still be executed even if the president and his cabinet were vaporized, the Pentagon established an elaborate continuity of government system with multiple redundant command posts, airborne command centers, and a clear chain of succession that would allow subordinate officers to launch the plan on their own authority.
There were nuclear-armed bombers perpetually in the air, submarines lurking in the ocean depths with sealed orders, and missile crews sitting in underground bunkers with launch keys and authentication codes, all prepared to execute PSYOP if they lost contact with higher authority for too long, which raises a terrifying question that military planners grappled with throughout the Cold War. What if the president is dead? What if Washington is gone? What if you're a bomber pilot or submarine commander and you haven't heard from anyone in hours? Do you launch your weapons and kill hundreds of millions of people based on protocol and procedure? Or do you hold back and risk allowing the enemy to consolidate their advantage? It's an impossible moral calculus, and yet thousands of American servicemen lived with this burden every single day, trained to carry out orders that would end civilization as we know it. And many of them, when interviewed years later after the Cold War ended, spoke of the psychological weight of this responsibility. Some described nightmares about accidentally launching during a false alarm. Others talked about the surreal cognitive dissonance of being a loving father and husband, while simultaneously being prepared to kill more people than had died in all previous wars in human history combined. And this gets at something profound about PSYOP and nuclear strategy more broadly, which is that it required normal human beings to internalize and normalize the absolute worst possibilities of human violence. It demanded that military officers, political leaders, and strategic planners spend their days thinking about megadeaths and acceptable casualty rates, and post-attack recovery scenarios, using sanitized language like collateral damage and strategic exchange, and mutually assured destruction to describe events that would involve children being vaporized in their schools, hospitals melting, entire cities turned to radioactive ash, families obliterated so completely that there would be no one left to mourn them. And the psychological impact of this work on the people involved is something we're only beginning to understand decades later, because how do you spend your career planning the end of the world, and then go home and kiss your kids goodnight without being fundamentally changed by that contradiction? And yet PSYOP demanded exactly this kind of compartmentalization from everyone involved, from the president down to the lowest-ranking missile technician. But let's talk about the actual mechanics of how SIOP would have been executed, because understanding the logistics of nuclear war helps illustrate just how meticulously planned this catastrophe was. The plan called for a coordinated strike involving multiple delivery systems launching in a carefully timed sequence. First would come the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, housed in hardened silos across the American Midwest. Places like North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming, where missile fields stretched across the prairie, each silo containing a Minuteman missile with a nuclear warhead, and these would launch first because they were the most vulnerable to a Soviet first strike, and needed to be used before they could be destroyed. The missiles would arc up through the atmosphere, reaching speeds of 15,000 miles per hour as they traveled over the North Pole towards Soviet targets. Warheads would separate in space and plunge back toward Earth, detonating with devastating precision over military bases, command centers, and ICBM fields in the Soviet Union, and this barrage alone would involve hundreds of warheads. The ICBMs were just the opening salvo, because simultaneously, American strategic bombers, the massive B-52 Stratofortresses that had been the backbone of nuclear deterrence since the 1950s, would be launching from bases across the United States and from forward positions in Europe and the Pacific. These bombers had been on alert status, some already airborne as part of the famous Chrome Dome missions, where nuclear-armed aircraft flew continuous patrols near Soviet airspace, ready to proceed to their targets at a moment's notice. And once the order was given, they would fly toward the Soviet Union at high altitude, protected by electronic countermeasures and fighter escorts, each bomber carrying multiple nuclear weapons, both gravity bombs and air-launched cruise missiles, designed to strike targets deeper in Soviet territory that the ICBMs might have missed, or that required additional destruction, and these bomber crews knew that many of them would not be coming home, that Soviet air defenses would shoot down a percentage of the attacking aircraft. But the plan accepted these losses as inevitable, because enough bombers would get through to complete their mission. And then there were the submarines, perhaps the most terrifying component of PSYOP, because they represented the ultimate insurance policy, the guarantee of retaliation even if the entire American mainland was destroyed. American ballistic missile submarines, each carrying 16 or 24 Polaris or Poseidon missiles, lurked in the depths of the world's oceans, constantly moving to avoid detection, maintaining radio silence except for scheduled communication windows, when they would rise to periscope depth to receive orders. And these submarines were virtually invulnerable to a Soviet first strike, because the ocean is vast and submarines are nearly impossible to track once they submerge, which meant that even if the Soviets somehow managed to destroy every American city and military base in a surprise attack, these submarines would survive and would execute their portion of SIOP, launching their missiles from beneath the waves to devastate Soviet targets in a retaliatory strike that would ensure mutual destruction. And this is the true meaning of mutually assured destruction: the recognition that neither side could launch a first strike without guaranteeing their own annihilation, because those submarines would always survive to take revenge. But here's where PSYOP gets even more disturbing, because the plan didn't just target military installations and strategic assets. It explicitly included Soviet cities and civilian populations as part of the target set. This wasn't collateral damage or an unfortunate side effect. It was deliberate strategic targeting based on the theory of counter-value strikes, the idea that you could deter Soviet aggression by holding their population hostage, threatening to destroy Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and dozens of other cities in retaliation for any attack. And Pentagon planners had calculated exactly how many nuclear weapons would be needed to kill a certain percentage of the Soviet urban population. They had maps with circles drawn around cities showing the blast radius, thermal damage radius, and fallout patterns. They knew that a 1-megaton warhead detonated over central Moscow would kill approximately 1 million people instantly and injure 2 million more, that the resulting firestorm would consume everything within a 10-mile radius, that survivors would face radiation sickness, starvation, and the complete breakdown of social order, and they had multiplied these calculations across dozens of cities, creating what amounted to a mathematical formula for genocide. And the same was true for Chinese cities, because PSYOP initially included China as a target, even though the Sino-Soviet split had already begun to fracture the communist bloc. The plan called for striking Beijing, Shanghai, and other major Chinese cities simply because they were allied with the Soviet Union. Never mind that China's nuclear arsenal was primitive and posed little threat to the United States. Never mind that involving China would expand the war unnecessarily. The logic of PSYOP demanded comprehensive destruction of all communist powers. And this indiscriminate targeting reveals something crucial about the mentality that produced the plan, which was a tendency to view the enemy not as human beings, but as abstract strategic problems to be solved through overwhelming force. Clearer than in the discussion of acceptable losses, because PSYOP's architects had to grapple with the question of how many American casualties would be acceptable in a nuclear exchange. And the answer they arrived at was chillingly pragmatic. Pentagon studies in the early 1960s estimated that a full Soviet first strike against American cities would kill approximately 70 to 80 million Americans, roughly 40% of the population. But military planners argued that this was survivable from a national perspective, that the remaining 60% could rebuild, that American civilization would endure even after such catastrophic losses. And therefore, PSYOP was designed not to prevent these casualties, but to ensure that Soviet losses would be even greater, that the enemy would suffer more than we did, which is a type of thinking that only makes sense if you've abstracted human suffering into statistical models and strategic calculations. If you've forgotten that each of those 70 million deaths represents a person with hopes and fears and loved ones, a life snuffed out in an instant of nuclear fire. But for PSYOP's planners, these were necessary abstractions, because confronting the full moral weight of what they were planning might have made the task impossible. And yet, we can't simply dismiss these men as monsters or as morally blind bureaucrats, because many of them genuinely believed they were preventing World War III. They believed that by planning for the absolute worst-case scenario, by making it clear that any Soviet aggression would result in their total destruction, they were actually making nuclear war less likely. It was deterrence through terror, the threat of annihilation as a peacekeeping force, and to some extent, this logic worked. Because despite numerous close calls and moments of crisis, the United States and Soviet Union never did launch their nuclear arsenals at each other. The Cold War remained cold, fought through proxies and espionage and economic competition, but never erupting into the direct superpower conflict that PSYOP was designed to address. So in a twisted way, you could argue that PSYOP succeeded by never being used, that its very existence as a credible threat helped prevent the war it was designed to fight. But this success came at an enormous cost, both financial and psychological. Because maintaining PSYOP required spending hundreds of billions of dollars on nuclear weapons, delivery systems, command and control infrastructure, and defensive measures. Money that could have been spent on education, healthcare, infrastructure, or poverty reduction. And beyond the financial cost, there was the psychological burden on society. An entire generation grew up with the knowledge that nuclear annihilation could come at any moment. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. Civil defense officials distributed pamphlets explaining what to do if you saw the flash of a nuclear explosion. And this background radiation of existential dread, this constant low-level anxiety about the end of the world, shaped the culture and politics of the Cold War era in ways we're still grappling with today. And it's worth noting that the Soviets had their own equivalent to PSYOP, their own plans for nuclear war, that were just as comprehensive and just as terrifying. Soviet military doctrine emphasized survivability and the ability to fight and win a nuclear war, which meant they built thousands of weapons, maintained massive civil defense programs, and planned for the systematic destruction of American and NATO targets. So both sides were locked in this spiral of mutual planning for mutual destruction, each trying to stay one step ahead of the other, constantly updating their war plans to account for new weapons, new intelligence about enemy capabilities, new theories of nuclear strategy. And this created a bizarre situation where the world's two superpowers employed thousands of brilliant minds, the best scientists and strategists and military thinkers, not to solve problems or improve human welfare, but to devise ever more efficient ways of killing hundreds of millions of people. It was intellectual talent devoted to destruction, human ingenuity in service of annihilation, and the absurdity of this situation was not lost on everyone. Throughout the Cold War, there were critics who pointed out the madness of nuclear strategy. People like Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers and also tried to warn the public about the dangers of nuclear war plans. Or scientists like Carl Sagan, who researched nuclear winter and warned that a nuclear exchange might kill everyone on Earth through climate effects, not just the targeted populations. And these voices argued for alternative approaches, for nuclear disarmament, for a fundamental rethinking of national security that didn't rely on the threat of genocide. But they were largely ignored or dismissed as naive idealists who didn't understand the harsh realities of international power politics. Because the national security establishment had convinced itself that nuclear deterrence was not only necessary but rational, that the logic of mutually assured destruction was sound strategy rather than collaborative insanity. And so SIOP continued to evolve throughout the Cold War, each new iteration adding more targets, incorporating new weapon systems, refining the timing and coordination of strikes. PSYOP 63 gave way to PSYOP 5 in 1976, which introduced more flexible targeting options and tried to distinguish between military and civilian targets more clearly. Though in practice, these distinctions were often meaningless, because nuclear weapons are so destructive that hitting a military base near a city would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians anyway. And then came PSYOP 6 in the early 1980s during the Reagan administration, developed at the height of Cold War tensions when both sides were deploying new intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and the rhetoric of nuclear confrontation reached levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And throughout all these iterations, the fundamental nature of the plan remained the same: a coordinated massive strike designed to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to wage war, to retaliate, or to survive as a functioning society. And it's important to understand that PSYOP wasn't just a theoretical document gathering dust in a Pentagon vault. It was a living operational plan that was constantly being updated and exercised. Military units regularly trained on their portions of the plan. Bomber crews flew practice missions. Missile launch officers went through simulated launch procedures. Submarine commanders rehearsed their attack profiles, and senior military and civilian leaders participated in war games where they would work through scenarios that might lead to PSYOPs execution, trying to understand the decision-making process, the timelines, the information they would have or lack in a crisis. And these exercises were often sobering experiences, because even in simulations, participants quickly realized how little time they would have to make decisions, how ambiguous the intelligence might be, how easy it would be to mistake a false alarm for a real attack, or to escalate a limited conflict into a nuclear exchange through miscalculation or misunderstanding. And there were several incidents during the Cold War where PSYOP came frighteningly close to being executed by accident. Times when technical glitches or human error created false indicators of a Soviet attack, and American forces began preparing for war. The most famous of these was probably the 1983 incident, when Soviet early warning systems detected what appeared to be incoming American missiles. Lieutenant Colonel named Stanislav Petrov was faced with the decision of whether to report this to his superiors, which would have triggered Soviet nuclear retaliation under their version of PSYOP, or to trust his gut instinct that it was a false alarm, and Petrov chose not to report it, determining that the detection was probably a computer error. And he was right. The system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. But if Petrov had followed protocol and reported the detection, the Soviet Union might have launched a retaliatory strike against the United States, triggering PSYOP in response. And billions of people would have died because of a computer glitch and bureaucratic procedures. And this incident, which only became public knowledge years later, illustrates just how fragile the system was, how dependent on individual human judgment in moments of extreme pressure. And there were similar close calls on the American side, including a famous incident in 1979, when a training tape was accidentally loaded into NORAD's computers, creating the appearance of a massive Soviet attack. And for several minutes, American forces prepared to execute PSYOP before someone realized the error. And another incident in 1980, when a faulty computer chip generated random digits that the early warning system interpreted as incoming missiles. And again, cooler heads prevailed, and disaster was averted. But each of these near misses revealed the fundamental problem with PSYOP and nuclear strategy more broadly, which was that it required perfect rationality and perfect information in circumstances where both would be in extremely short supply. Because in a real crisis, with minutes or even seconds to make decisions, with incomplete or contradictory information, with the stress and fear and chaos of a potential nuclear war, how could anyone be expected to make the kind of measured, rational judgments that the system depended on? And yet this was exactly what PSYOP demanded. And military planners knew this was a weakness, but had no good solution for it, because the physics of ICBMs meant that warning times would always be measured in minutes. Destructive power of nuclear weapons meant that any delay in response might prove fatal. So the system was designed to enable rapid decision-making and rapid execution, which inevitably meant accepting some level of risk of accidental war. And this trade-off between the need for speed and the need for caution was never fully resolved throughout the Cold War. And as weapons became more sophisticated and delivery times shortened, the problem only got worse. Because by the 1980s, both sides were developing weapons like submarine-launched cruise missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe that could strike their targets in just a few minutes, compressing decision-making timelines to the point where launching on warning, firing your weapons as soon as you detected an incoming attack, rather than waiting to confirm the strike, became a serious consideration. And this hair-trigger posture made the world even more dangerous, because it meant that a false alarm or a misunderstanding could trigger a full nuclear exchange before anyone had time to verify what was actually happening. And some military strategists actually advocated for launch on warning as official policy, arguing that it was the only way to ensure your weapons would survive a Soviet first strike. But civilian leaders generally resisted this, recognizing that it would effectively hand over the decision to start World War III to early warning computers and their operators, removing human judgment from the most consequential decision in history. But even without an official launch-on-warning policy, the practical reality was that decision-makers would have at most 15 to 20 minutes to evaluate a potential attack and decide whether to execute SIOP. And this created what scholars call the stability-instability paradox, where the very weapons meant to ensure peace through deterrence actually made accidental war more likely by requiring such rapid responses. And this paradox haunted strategic thinkers throughout the Cold War, because there was no obvious solution. You couldn't unilaterally slow down your response times without giving the enemy an advantage. But maintaining hair-trigger alert status meant living permanently on the edge of catastrophe. And this brings us to the end of the Cold War and the question of what happened to PSYOP after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Because suddenly the entire rationale for the plan evaporated. The existential enemy that justified maintaining thousands of nuclear weapons and planning for global annihilation no longer existed. Russia was in chaos, its economy collapsing, its military in disarray. It posed no credible threat of a surprise attack on the United States. And yet, PSYOP didn't disappear. It simply evolved, renamed and restructured, but fundamentally similar in its approach. Because the Pentagon and the nuclear weapons complex that had grown up around PSYOP had tremendous institutional inertia. Thousands of jobs and billions of dollars depended on maintaining the nuclear arsenal and the war plans that justified it. And there were always new enemies or potential enemies that could be slotted into the target list. Rogue states like North Korea and Iran developing nuclear weapons, the possibility of a resurgent Russia, the emerging challenge of China. So the single integrated operational plan became OPLAN 8010, the operations plan for global strike, which retained much of PSYOP's structure while adding flexibility for limited nuclear strikes and conventional prompt global strike options. And today, decades after the Cold War ended, the United States still maintains approximately 3,700 nuclear warheads, 1,700 deployed on missiles and bombers ready for use. And there are still military officers sitting in missile silos in North Dakota and Wyoming. Still submarines patrolling the oceans with nuclear weapons. Still bombers on alert status. All maintained for contingencies that many experts argue are vanishingly unlikely. And Russia maintains a similar arsenal. And both countries still have war plans that probably look a lot like PSYOP in their essential features, though the details are classified and unlikely to be revealed anytime soon. And this persistence of Cold War nuclear strategy raises important questions about whether we've really learned anything from that dangerous era. Whether we've internalized the lessons of how close we came to accidental annihilation, or whether we're doomed to repeat the same patterns of threat and counter-threat, build-up and deterrence, with new actors and new weapons, but the same fundamental logic. Make nuclear strategy even more complex than it was during the Cold War, including cyber warfare that could potentially compromise command and control systems, making it harder to ensure that nuclear weapons are only used when authorized, or artificial intelligence and automated systems that might someday be integrated into nuclear decision-making, raising terrifying possibilities of algorithmic error or machine-initiated nuclear war. And then there's the problem of nuclear proliferation. As more countries acquire nuclear weapons, the neat Cold War logic of bilateral deterrence breaks down, replaced by a multipolar nuclear world, where miscalculation and escalation become even more likely. And some of these new nuclear powers lack the sophisticated command and control systems and safety protocols that the US and Soviet Union developed over decades, making accidental or unauthorized use more probable. And terrorism introduces another variable, the possibility that a non-state actor could acquire a nuclear weapon and use it without the deterrent logic that kept nation-states in check during the Cold War. And all of these developments suggest that the world is in some ways more dangerous now than it was at the height of the Cold War, despite the absence of the superpower confrontation that originally spawned SIOP. Because the fundamental problem hasn't been solved, which is that nuclear weapons exist, and as long as they exist, there will be plans for how to use them. And those plans, no matter how carefully constructed, carry the risk of ending human civilization. And this brings us back to where we started, with the question of what to make of PSYOP, this secret war plan that no one dared to use. And perhaps the most important lesson is that good intentions and rational planning are not sufficient safeguards against catastrophe when the tools at hand are capable of destroying the world. Because the people who created PSYOP were not cartoon villains or madmen. They were thoughtful, intelligent, patriotic individuals who genuinely believed they were protecting their country and preserving peace through strength. But the logic of nuclear deterrence led them to create a plan that would have ended civilization if ever implemented. And the fact that we survived the Cold War without executing PSYOP is not proof that the strategy was sound. It's proof that we were lucky. Lucky that the various close calls and false alarms didn't trigger a catastrophic chain of events. Lucky that cooler heads prevailed in crisis after crisis. Lucky that despite the hair trigger alert status and the compressed decision-making timelines, no one made the fatal error that would have launched the missiles, and we cannot count on being lucky forever, which is why the story of PSYOP should serve as a warning about the dangers of placing too much faith in deterrence, in technological solutions to political problems, in strategies that rely on the perpetual rationality of human beings under extreme stress. Because PSYOP reveals the logical endpoint of deterrence thinking, where the only way to prevent war is to make it so terrible that no one would dare start it. And this logic, taken to its extreme, produces plans that are themselves almost as terrible as the wars they're meant to prevent. And perhaps the real secret of PSYOP is not its specific targets or its detailed execution plans, but the fact that it existed at all, that two groups of human beings, Americans and Soviets, could look at each other across an ideological divide and decide that the appropriate insurance policy for their security was the capacity to exterminate each other's entire civilization. That we normalized this arrangement, built it into our institutions and our budgets and our daily lives, and managed to convince ourselves that this was not madness, but prudent strategy. And now, more than 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, we still live with the legacy of PSYOP, in the thousands of nuclear weapons that remain in arsenals around the world, in the military doctrines that still contemplate nuclear use, in the command systems and early warning networks that still maintain vigilance against attack, and in the psychological scars left on a generation that grew up under the shadow of potential annihilation. And the question we must ask ourselves is whether we have the wisdom to finally step back from this precipice, to recognize that no political goal, no ideological principle, no national interest can justify maintaining the capacity for omnicide, for the murder of everything, or whether we will continue down the path that PSYOP represents, refining and updating our plans for the end of the world, convincing ourselves that we can manage these terrible weapons indefinitely without error or accident, until one day, perhaps, someone does dare to use the plan that was never meant to be used, and all of our carefully constructed deterrence logic and strategic calculations prove to be nothing more than elaborate rationalizations for our own extinction. Because that is the ultimate secret of PSYOP, that it was never really about winning a war. It was about losing everything while taking the enemy with you, and calling that victory. And if that doesn't terrify you, if that doesn't make you question the entire logic of nuclear deterrence, then perhaps we haven't learned anything from the Cold War at all, and we're doomed to repeat it with even more terrible weapons, and even less time to pull back from the brink. And future generations, if there are any, will look back at our era and wonder how we could have been so reckless, so arrogant in our faith that we could control these apocalyptic forces, and they will shake their heads at the secret war plan that no one dared to use until perhaps someone finally did.